Bill Butterworth once told of a story that happened to him while he was waiting to board his flight. The flight was a full flight, so there's limited seating sitting around him. Yet there was 2 open seats right next to him, and 2 college-age girls came and sat next to him. As they were waiting, they engaged in conversation, sharing a little bit of information about themselves. And when they found out about Bill being a Christian and what he does, they immediately shared that they go to church and that they love Jesus. Well, at the same time, as they were sharing a little bit more information, as again they were waiting for their flight, these 2 girls open up and state that they not only have boyfriends, but they are indeed living with their boyfriends, and they saw nothing wrong with that. Now, Bill didn't pry at all, but when he told this story a couple years ago, and when hearing this story, what came to mind was that these girls just lacked the understanding of what it's like to represent Christ. Either they were doing something wrong with their boyfriends there at the house, or just the mere fact of the perception, or even the not respecting the powers and the temptation of the devil by living with their boyfriends. And to not see anything wrong with that just goes to show of the lack of mentorship that surrounds these 2 young ladies and these 2 seemingly young believers. And this brings us to the point of this class. You see, here in the Western church, for the majority, there is a huge downfall in discipleship. There's a huge downfall in mentorship. For it seems that throughout this last decade, or at least 2 decades, the goal has been to get people in the church and get people baptized, and then have them fend for themselves against the wolves. And no wonder why the church has lost its salt. No wonder why when you go down the street and look at a professing Christian that you can't tell the difference between a Christian and a non-Christian. No wonder why the divorce rate is still around 50% for both believers and non-believers. I believe that it has a direct relationship with the fact that discipleship is no longer present in the Western church. This class will indeed change your life. Now, when we go through this study, and we go through this gospel, the Gospel of John, and focusing on discipleship, we are going to be challenged. We're going to be seemingly at times overwhelmed. We are going to be presented information and connections that we've never seen before. But at the same time, we are going to have a foundation and a very simply understood meaning to each message, each study, and each chapter that we go through. That's going to relate to how we resemble Christ and how we can continue to grow in Christ and how we can disciple others. Not only does our lives have the potential to be changed in this class, but also the lives around us. As our view of Jesus changes and holds to more reverence, our lifestyles are going to change. And when our lifestyles are going to change, other people are going to take notice, and they will indeed, through our testimony, hopefully have a new, if not a closer, relationship with Jesus. This class is going to prepare us to be not only discipled, but also is going to prepare us to indeed disciple. But first we need to understand what discipleship looks like in a biblical context. What is a disciple? What are the standards of Jesus when he says, my disciples? And if you are to be my disciples, what are the criteria that Jesus has for he lays out in the Gospels? Well, the biblical definition of a disciple is a believer that has counted the cost and is able to deny themselves and daily take up their cross and follow Christ, being committed to spiritual disciplines and obeying his commands. Thus, being transformed into Christ-likeness, the believer will develop their full potential for Christ and his mission. That's a full definition taken into context of what Jesus expects his disciples to uphold and his followers to live by. But when you're going to go talk to someone else and you want to just try to describe of what a disciple is, you're not going to give them that lengthy definition. You'll lose them after the first sentence. So here's a definition of what a disciple is. It is taken for 2 verses. Matthew 4:19 and 1 Corinthians 11:1. The first part is to follow me. It is the purpose, direction, and a question that everyone needs to ask. Not only themselves, but others if it's a discipleship relationship. First things first, we need to ask if we're going to be followers of Christ. We're going to be disciples of Christ. Christ went to his disciples and asked them to follow him. It is a choice being made. There's a purpose behind that. So, the first part of being a disciple is follow. The second part, taken from 1 Corinthians 11:1, when Paul states, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So there we go. We got follow me as I imitate Christ. That is the simple understanding of what a disciple is according to Christ. Discipleship. What does it look like? What is the purpose of discipleship? Well, back in Jesus' time when he was calling his disciples, a rabbi, which is known as a teacher, would have someone behind him, or a couple people behind him, men behind him, and they will be known as a disciple. And a perfect picture of this would be Paul and Gamaliel, where Gamaliel was his teacher, and Paul was being discipled. Now, the purpose of the disciplee was to perfectly reflect and represent the one doing the discipling. So when those two were ever apart, or when the discipleship ended, they would take a look at Paul and they would know that he was a student of Gamaliel just by his teachings, by his actions, and how he portrayed himself. This is the purpose of a discipleship. And later after Paul, he confirms this, as we read in 1 Corinthians 11:1, in that once he became a disciple of Christ, Paul tells the church of Corinth to imitate him, to be a disciple of him as he imitates Christ, who discipled Paul. This is the bread and butter of what a disciple is. Discipleship, it is a decision. It is a decision and a surrender to imitate the one that is doing the discipling. That is discipleship. And indeed, Paul is correct in stating that it is not him anymore, as it was like with his teacher, Gamaliel. It was and is and always will be about Christ and imitating Christ. Christ is the true parent. Christ is the true discipleship parent. And as we go through and look at discipleship, there are indeed 5 stages of discipleship. There are 5 stages. You have stage 1, which represents being dead, a non-believer. And then you're going to move into stage 2, which identifies as an infant, a new believer, a new creation. As we're going to study in John 3, to be born again, like any baby, just desiring the milk, the basics. I believe in Jesus Christ, and I'm confessing with my mouth that He is Lord, and I believe in my heart that God raised Him from the dead. This milk, this understanding, this basic understanding is the infant. And then you have children. They're introducing into, if you want to look at the Awana and upbringing and the Bible verse memorization. Yet they don't understand necessarily maybe the application of these Bible verses, but they're there, we're implanting them there, the children. And the same thing for new believers. As they move from infant to the milk and they start to develop a little bit of solids. And then you have the young adults who at this point, they're understanding. They've been eating meat for a while. They're growing and making connections, and they're understanding doctrines and theologies and actively and representing Christ in a faithful manner. And yet at this time we're preparing them for ministry. And then when they're ready, then you got the parents, the discipleship parents. These are that are going to be ready to go out and become disciple makers. These are the 5 stages that we're going to go through and we're going to look at, we're going to see in this study. And we'll explain a little more later on how and why we're able to do that. But you got the dead, the unbelieving, you have the infants, you have the children, you have the young adults, and then you have the parents, the disciple makers. But one question remains. How can we disciple others without being a true disciple of Christ? And the answer is we can't. We need to be a true disciple of Christ in order to disciple others under the imitation that we are giving of our discipler, Christ. Meaning that how can we imitate Christ, which is our goal in disciple making? How are we to imitate Christ if we don't know Him, or if we are not living according to His standards? And we can't. We got to first check ourselves, check our own relationship, check our own walk before we can go on and disciple others. Otherwise, we're given a false impression. Otherwise, we're given false representation and imitation of Christ. Paul said it very clear that they are to imitate Him as He imitates Christ. The two are together. You can't have one without the other. Yet in today's society, like stated before, there's no difference in most of the professing Christians. There's no difference in the lifestyle. There's no difference in their walk. There's no difference in their prayer life or the lack thereof. So how can we expect change elsewhere if we continue on living in the way that we're living and expecting everything's going to change because we're going to disciple? No, it starts with us. It starts within, and it starts with our relationship with Christ. And this brings us to the Gospel of John. Scholars such as Dr. Towns and John MacArthur view this Gospel as the Gospel of Gospels, or the Holy of Holies in the New Testament. You see, this Gospel, unlike the other three Gospels with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, was written separate. In fact, this Gospel was written roughly around in the early 80 AD, or 10 years after the destruction of the temple. And it was written in Ephesus by John the Apostle. But what makes this Gospel different from the other three Gospels is seen as how Christ is related in the Gospels. For instance, in Matthew, Christ is related as the Messiah. In Mark, Christ is related as a servant of Jehovah. In Luke, Christ is the perfect man. But in John's Gospel, Christ is related as the Son of God. You see, Matthew, Mark, and Luke look at Christ through a human perspective, a horizontal perspective, as I will look at you and you will look at me. But in John's Gospel, he writes in such a way and describes Christ in such a way that it looks at Christ through a vertical lens as God looks down upon his Son on this earth. Christ is looked at as the Son of God, thus making this Gospel the most spiritual Gospel. Another comparison can be identified as, in Matthew, Christ is identified as the King. In Mark, the servant. In Luke, the man. And in John, your God. Like I stated before, this Gospel was written by John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee and the brother of James. Though he never mentions himself in this Gospel at all, by name. But we know when he's speaking about himself because he identifies himself as the one whom Jesus loved or the other disciple. Now, John, when he first met Jesus, he was roughly 17 or 18 years old. A zealous teenager. Now, if we think back to how we were when we were 17, 18 years old, as most teenagers are, they view themselves as invincible, as nothing can touch them, as they know it all, and this is no different than John. Yet, through the 3 years of being discipled by Christ, we see such a transformation that in John 19, Christ is looking down from the cross, and he sees his mother, and he sees John the Apostle, and he says, "Woman, behold your son, and son, behold your mother." Jesus saw humility at that point. Jesus saw a man at that point being transformed from a boy. And Jesus entrusted his most dear relationship on this earth, his own mother, into the care of not his half-brothers, but he trusted his care into this apostle called John. This is the author that we get to observe through the 3 years of Jesus' ministry. These 3 years of John's life were so transformed like other disciples, but John here gives us the privilege of seeing these 3 years of ministry of Jesus' life and the growth of not only him, but the 12 disciples through the 3 years of ministry. You see, John's gospel is written in chronological order, covering 3 years of Jesus' ministry, unlike the other 3 gospels that focused mainly on 1 year of Jesus' ministry. While John's gospel starts with the first Passover of Jesus' ministry in chapter 2, verse 13, you have the baptism, and then going right into the first Passover, the first year, the beginning of the first year of Jesus' ministry. Going to chapter 5, verse 1, you got the second Passover, beginning of the second ministry. However, John covers one event in his second year of ministry. Thus, leading to chapter 6, verse 4, you got the third Passover, which is the beginning of the third year of Jesus' ministry. And then in chapter 11, verse 55, at the close of chapter 11, you have the fourth Passover, the crucifixion. You see, John spends the first 11 chapters on 3 years of ministry. And then he spends 10 more chapters on the last week, the last instructions given, the last preparations that Christ has given his disciples leading up to that final Passover. You see, John's emphasis on Jesus' final, if you want to say pass down, or final, if you want to look from a sports perspective, the final pregame talk before the big game, before it's time for actually to perform and do the job out there on the field. John remembers this so vividly that he takes 10 chapters to fulfill it. So leading up into this fourth Passover, it takes you through the upper room discourse. It takes you through the walk to the Garden of Gethsemane. And then it takes you in resounding of Jesus' prayer for himself, for his disciples, and for the world, as we're going to talk about. And John records that so vividly and so detailed that we're going to spend much time and much study and meditation on that. And it's going to be so fulfilling. Because this is Jesus here praying and talking to God, his Father, as we ought to be praying and talking to God, our Father. You see, John's Gospel is the most widely used gospel in the mission field. And the reason for that is that this gospel is so simply understood. The message, the meaning is right there, so clear. It radiates through the pages of the verses. Yet at the same time, it is so deep in knowledge. And the more you study it, the more you just keep on digging, and the more revealings that come up out of each sign or out of each discourse or conversation. It's like when you're standing on top of a cliff, and if you enjoy cliff jumping, and you're standing on top of the cliff and you're looking down and see the water's so clear that you can see the rocks and the boulders and how they lay out and how they just embed into the sand and the water floor. And as you're looking down, you're like, my, it's so clearly seen. It looks so shallow because I can see the bottom. And you step back to contemplate whether you want to jump or not. And as you step back, another person runs right beside you and jumps off the cliff, and you're just awestruck at it. But then you come to realize that if you try to swim down, it's so deep. And when we study this gospel and we look at these verses and the underlying meanings of the verses and the theology behind this gospel, there is at no point that we're going to be able to close this book and say to ourselves, I understand it all. I don't need to study anymore. No matter what you do and where you look and what verse you turn up and what passage or sign or discourse that you want to look into, there's always more to learn. There's always more to study. And that's this gospel. The message, the purpose is simple and is so clear. But at the same time, to study everything and try to grasp every single thing that John records is unattainable in this lifetime. And that bottom is so clear in revealing this purpose of John's gospel, which is found in chapter 20, verse 31. Chapter 20, verse 31 says, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. You see, John loves the word believe. It's going to be rating throughout this whole gospel 98 times. And also found next to that is going to be life, found 36 times in this gospel. John's gospel is written for, like stated before, a purpose. It has a thesis statement, which we just read in John chapter 20, verse 31. This is a thesis statement. This statement here, to believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and you will have life in his name. This statement is the purpose for the whole writing of John's gospel. Nothing in John's gospel is written apart from the idea of this thesis statement, to believe in Jesus Christ and to have life in his name. Believe that he is the Son of God. John does this because John does this in the way that he records 7 events, 7 discourses, and when we get to it, 7 witnesses of Christ. John uses the number 7 because 7 is God's number. And it is God's number in reference to the creation. God's number, because God took 7 days to create everything. Also, God affirms that 7 is his number because in the events, in the celebrations such as the Passover or the Feast of Tabernacles, God commands Israel to celebrate it for 7 days. See, unlike anything else where we get the day, which is 24 hours, which is the rotation of the earth about its axis, or we got a year, which is the earth revolving around the sun, or we have the month, which is the cycle of the moon, the phases of the moon. You see, all of these revolve around what has been created, but only 7 revolves around God. 7 is God's number. When you read the Bible and you see 7, it represents God. But there's another number which John recognizes. And that number is the number 7, which represents God plus 1. That number is the number of eternity. You see, 7, which God also amazingly implants into his creation. If you look at the rainbow, you get 7 spectrums of light, 7 colors of light. If you look at music, you have 7 notes to an octave. We'll get to that. You have do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But what I just sang for you is what you're accustomed to. But that's actually 8 notes of what I gave you. Let's see, do them again. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You notice that there's 2 do's. That do is actually the beginning of the next octave. That's the 7 plus 1. That's the continuation. That's the eternity. It's the same for our eternal God. And John's going to use 7 plus 1 to show that as God the Father is eternal, Jesus Christ is the same eternal. One way that we're going to describe right here how John uses the 7 plus 1 is the sayings of Jesus, in that he describes himself and identifies himself as I am. Jesus gets the identification of I am, which in Greek is ego eimi, I am. In the same reference that God spoke to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3:14, God says, I am that I am. That is how Jesus and how John identifies Jesus as claiming that he is indeed the Son of God. Now look closely. In John 6:35, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. In John 8:12, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. John 10:7 says, I am the door. In 10:11, I am the good shepherd. In 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. In John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In John 15:5, I am the vine. And throughout the gospel, John writes, and Jesus identifying himself when people question him, who are you, so and so? Are you the Son of God? Are you Jesus of Nazareth? And he says, I am. But listen to the last point on this. In that the last of an answer to of who Jesus is from another person, mainly the Pharisees or the guards. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the last recording of with the I ams of Jesus answering, they approach Jesus at night, the guards, with Judas. And they say, are you the Jesus of Nazareth? And Jesus says, I am. And how awesome is it that this last I am that John records here, the 7 plus 1, the guards, when they heard this, they fall backwards. They fall backwards when Jesus says, I am. The 7 plus 1 that John records, the guards fall backwards in response to Jesus answering, I am. So powerful, so amazing. And if John did it on purpose, wow. That is, what an exclamation point that John writes here. And Jesus, to identify Jesus as the eternal God, the same as God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. Jesus Christ is God, and by believing that he is God, we will have life eternal. Knowing Jesus through John's Gospel is so powerful on what we just mentioned, that unlike the other Gospels, John's Gospel has a vertical lens that we get to see down from heaven how God sees Jesus and identifying Jesus as the Son of God. And also we described why we're studying discipleship through this, because we get to see the journey of the 3 years of Jesus' ministry through the growth of the disciples during those 3 years. That's why we're studying discipleship with this gospel. Because at the beginning, the disciples were not ready. They believed, but they weren't ready. 3 years it took them from identifying Jesus as just a good teacher to John 20:28, when Thomas identifies Jesus as his Lord and his God. This is what John is saying, that you may believe that Jesus is my Lord, your Lord, and my God, and your God. And you believe that in your heart, and you're able to confess that in your mouth, or by your mouth. That's what John's purpose and gospel is all about. And we get to see the growth as we would be growing and are growing the same. This is not a matter of salvation. Discipleship is a matter of sanctification. And we get to see the sanctification of John 2, when the disciples see Jesus' first miracle, spend that first week with him, all the way to the end, when the disciples finally believe fully in their heart and understand fully in their minds that Jesus is their Lord and their God. I pray that through this study, God will reveal himself in ways that we never could imagine. I pray in this study that we will be awakened in seeing and observing and be listening for God to show himself to us even more so. I pray that our walk and the fruitfulness throughout each day will be ever more increasing and bearing fruit for our God. I pray that we will understand what it's like to see this world through Jesus' lens and to walk in a way that Jesus would walk. And I pray that throughout this study and by the end of this study, we will be able to fully confess and understand what it means to live a life that resembles our understanding and our belief that Jesus Christ is our Lord and our God. May God bless you and keep you in this one true faith unto life everlasting. Amen.